Russia continues to pour older and older armor into the Ukrainian meat grinder. Is it running out of tanks? The number of tanks destroyed over the course of a year's fighting in Ukraine has been truly staggering. Yet despite premature predictions of the tank's imminent demise, it remains crucial to ongoing operations for both sides. But while Ukraine tries to crowdsource more tanks from the West, Russia has had to delve deeper into its surplus stocks from Soviet times. The country once touting its next-generation T-14 Armata is now sending T-62s into battle. It's not a good look for Putin and his Russian military, once considered the second best in the world. What's going to happen to Russian armor in Ukraine? We're now well over 300 days into a conflict many assumed would be over in a matter of weeks. With each passing day, more and more Russian vehicles meet their doom. Now, more than 8,700 pieces of expensive military equipment have been independently verified as either destroyed, abandoned, or captured. But this is just a minimum estimate drawn from publicly available footage. This number includes more than 1,500 tanks, almost 1,000 of which have been destroyed outright, with the rest either abandoned or captured. Russia deployed just 2,800 tanks at the start of the war, a number that at the time seemed insurmountable for the outnumbered Ukrainians. But the Pentagon recently announced that Russia has now lost half of its main battle tanks. Yeah, you heard that right. Huge losses were sustained during the Kharkiv counteroffensive last autumn, when the Russian army was reportedly losing 10 tanks per day, while the Ukrainians were losing just 2. Jarring figures when you consider the Russians were defending rather than attacking. Paired with the loss of over 110,000 Russian soldiers killed, wounded, and missing thus far, casualties described as orders of magnitude more than the Soviet Union experienced in Afghanistan in 10 years. The American Undersecretary for Defense recently argued that Russia will emerge from this war weaker than it went in. It does seem reasonable, if not plain obvious. Ukraine still has a long road ahead, but it enjoys material support from all over the world. Russia, on the other hand, does not. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to deduce that losses like these simply aren't sustainable over the long term. Pressure is mounting on Putin and his advisors. His once formidable armored force is slowly but markedly deteriorating. How did it all come to this? There's a lot of reasons why Ukraine is massively outperforming Russian armor on the battlefield. Russia's armored foibles derive first and foremost from two big factors: Ukraine's national resolve and its superior fighting doctrine. When fighting for independence, you simply do whatever it takes to win, even at great sacrifice. Ukraine has put its money where its mouth is, showing great heart on the battlefield despite dreadful material losses. Ukraine's tactical acumen has been on full display too. At varying points of the war, it has adapted a wide array of tactics to achieve specific operational ends. At the start of the campaign, it chose to employ its under-equipped, outnumbered forces in small hit-and-run style teams. With Russian columns strewn out on exposed roads lacking fuel and infantry protection, this made the most sense. Small crews equipped with anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs could travel light until they reached an appropriate range, fire from concealed positions, and light out to safety before they were detected. This tactic played its part in turning the tide in the defense of Kyiv. When Western countries saw how adept Ukrainians were at knocking out tanks and vehicles worth millions of dollars with man-operated ATGMs worth a fraction of that price, they poured even more into the country. Far more accurate than anything the Russians possess. Ukraine's arsenal of ATGMs also came with easy access to Western trainers and advisors who could help their handlers become even deadlier and more efficient over time. The humble ATGM has become a symbol of Ukraine's stubborn resistance. Beyond the Ukrainian-made Stugna P, there are 3 primary Western ATGM systems responsible for dealing an insane amount of damage to Russian tanks. The American FGM-148 Javelin, jointly manufactured by Raytheon Missiles and Defense and Lockheed Martin, leads the way, with more than 7,000 provided since the start of the conflict. The missile's trajectory is its biggest strength, fired in a high, near-vertical arc and descending at blistering speed before detonating around the exposed, under-armored portion at the top of the tank's turret. Javelins can penetrate even the best anti-missile protection systems and armor because they are fitted with 2 warheads, not 1. A primary charge disrupts the anti-missile countermeasures, while a secondary charge penetrates and detonates within the tank itself. Javelins are great anti-tank options, but their unique fire mode comes at a steep cost of around $200,000 per unit, with replacement missiles priced at around $78,000. Halfway through the conflict in the summer of 2022, however, Ukraine attributed between 30 to 40% of enemy tank losses to the British Next Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon, or NLAW. Sounds fierce? That's because it is. The NLAW is an engineering marvel. Designed by Saab Bofors Dynamics, a joint Swedish-British venture, the original NLAW project started back in the 1990s and finished in 2008. It was agreed that the finished product would not exceed 28 pounds, would have a small backblast footprint, and could be fired at a target as close as 20 and as far as 600 meters away. The lightweight result packs a heavy punch. Operators can select one of two fire modes: Overfly Top Attack, or OTA, where the missile uses magnetic sensors to detonate just over its target at a perpendicular angle, or Direct Attack, or DA mode. The big draw of the NLAW is its ease of use, and the fact that it uses a non-explosive charge when fired, meaning it can be launched from an enclosed space like a room, a trench, or cramped urban environments. They are still quite expensive, priced out at around $33,000 per shot. The Swedes played an important role in the NLAW's development, but they were hardly done there. Saab Bofors Dynamics also produces the one-shot wonder, AT-4 anti-tank missile, which has dealt its own fair share of damage to Russian tanks. The disposable, recoilless, smoothbore launcher fires a single anti-tank missile from a light, fiberglass tube at a range of 200 to 600 meters. Designed during the Cold War, the AT-4 can fire heat, anti-structure tandem warheads, extended range (ER), high explosive (HR), high penetration (HP), and reduced sensitivity (RS) rounds, whatever strikes your fancy, some of which can penetrate armor up to 600 millimeters thick. Widely adopted by the US Army as a replacement for the aging M72 LAW, it has been in service all over the world. So how is it faring in the Russian-Ukraine conflict? Thanks to the target-rich environment in Ukraine, there is now an ample body of evidence testifying to the AT-4's effectiveness. On January 16th, for example, a video surfaced on social media showing Russia's brand new T-90M Proryev 3 tank equipped with Nikita thermal camouflage burning in the Luhansk region. The $5 million tank had been destroyed by a cheaply manufactured Swedish AT-4 unit priced out at a mere $1,480. You could buy 130 AT-4s for the price of one Javelin, and that is incredibly good value for money. When you add in Switchblade anti-tank kamikaze drones and other anti-tank implements, you start to see why it has been so hard to make armored progress in tight cities, much less across the country's vast agrarian expanses. Ukrainians have grown more and more adept at using Western anti-tank missiles, and make no mistake, there is real skill involved when you factor the importance of target acquisition, good communications, accurate aerial observation, unit coordination, and other contingencies. Artillery bombardments called down to destroy broken or abandoned vehicles have been responsible for at least as many tanks as Western ATGMs, according to one Ukrainian infantryman. The Russians for a long time threw away tanks like they were wash rags, but they don't do that anymore, he said. Now I guess they're running out. Estimates place the rate of Ukrainian tank hits at 4 a day since the beginning of the struggle. That's like going outside and lighting tens of millions of dollars on fire every morning. Not exactly the outcome Putin might have hoped for. This is the chief reason Ukrainians are experiencing massive success whittling down Russian armored battalions. The trend shows no sign of abating. But there's another reason Russia has lost and continues to lose so many tanks, and it has to do with its tactical ineptitude. Russian tactical mistakes continue to mount. Derivative experts argue of a deeply flawed strategic approach from the Kremlin. This goes all the way back to the failed push on Kyiv. For quite some time, the Battalion Tactical Group, BTG, has been the backbone of the Russian military. Comprised of tanks, infantry, and artillery, this combined arms unit organization makes logical sense on the modern battlefield. However, Russia seemed to have gotten the balance of their BTGs all wrong, prioritizing armored vehicles, trucks, and tanks at the expense of the infantry needed to maintain, support, and protect them. Sure, this meant they would have hard-hitting, highly maneuverable units working in tandem, in theory, but in reality, when Russian BTGs came under attack, there simply weren't enough dismounted infantry to protect the armor or the logistic vehicles sustaining them. Convoys were caught in the open, eviscerated by the aforementioned Ukrainian strike teams laying in wait. Hiding in densely populated areas, forests, and other areas, the Ukrainians would fire, then flee to safety, leaving burning hulks of wrecked vehicles in their wake. If the Russians had chosen to include more infantry ahead and around their armored convoys, they would have been better equipped to detect and stop these ambushes. This wasn't the only problem. Russia's tactics were compounded by another fatal flaw. Since they don't enjoy air superiority, they couldn't rely on close air support to protect their armor. On top of that, it seems that they don't often survey the area with drones or aircraft, leaving armor exposed to Ukrainian infantry that are difficult to detect with the naked eye. It was constant, overwhelming air superiority and reliable intelligence that allowed American armored columns in Iraq and Afghanistan to thrive and survive, or at least avoid destruction by the thousands. Factor in the lack of sustainment, simple things like fuel, rations, and other vital necessities running out across the front lines, with the inability to salvage tanks that get stuck and abandoned in mud, and you have a recipe for disaster. Tractor-riding farmers of Ukraine, thank you for your donation. Over time, the attrition of his most experienced BTGs left Putin with no option but to funnel inexperienced conscripts into the fight. Russia is starting to move away from the battalion tactical groups as they realize how ineffective they are, but it's too little, too late. They wasted a massive amount of blood and treasure trying to make it work, and now they are left with undisciplined conscripts who appear more willing to abandon their tanks wholesale than try to salvage them or, barring that, destroying them to prevent them from falling into Ukrainian hands. More Russian tanks are being built to replace their losses, but can they be introduced faster than current models are being destroyed? The simple answer is no, unless they can build 30 tanks and armored trucks every single day. The average rate they are being destroyed. But that's just the beginning of Putin's tank problem. Though we don't often hear about their impact, Western sanctions on Russia have made it even harder to build the tanks and missiles it needs to prosecute Putin's war. Modern tanks are outfitted with a deeply complex array of electronic systems. Computer targeting, special sights, communication relays, everything relies on critical electronic components previously available to Russia only on the import market. Moscow has previously admitted that it was 15 years behind the rest of the world, producing its own semiconductors, which isn't a good look when so many of today's precision weapons rely so heavily on them. While Russia tries to recycle microprocessors from, yes, you're hearing it right, refrigerators and washing machines to rebuild its dwindling stocks, one British think tank claims that 27 types of captured Russian weapons all contained crucial components from 70 Western firms. Inflation has skyrocketed. Unemployment rates are creeping higher and higher as the absence of Western companies are felt. Industries are shutting their doors. Economic targeting of simple choke point components like ball bearings or fasteners by Western sanctions has had a huge impact. It can be the smallest things that are the hardest to find, where there might only be one source that produces them, the American Deputy Secretary for the Treasury said back in October. Weapons manufacturers are now trying to source the components they need on the black market, but in the interim, Western sanctions and embargoes have forced the Kremlin to crack open stocks of its Soviet-era dumb munitions that lack the computer guidance found so effective in today's models. Cannibalizing older pieces of equipment for spare parts is one way to try and stem the tide of armor losses, but it's hardly a good one. Taken together, many suspect these are the reasons that Russia's vaunted T-14 Armata program never got off the ground and onto the assembly line. Once purported to be the next-generation tank for the Russian armed forces, ambitious orders for thousands of T-14s, filed just a few years ago, remain completely unfilled. Russia has its hands so full maintaining its atrophying armed forces that it couldn't mobilize the resources and manpower to build a fleet of T-14s even if it wanted to. It's looking more and more likely that it won't be able to do it for a long time to come. So what do you do when your country lacks economic power, industrial capacity, and military readiness, but has to shoulder the burden of a rich historical legacy as one of the world's strongest military powers? Well, if you're Putin in 2023, it appears that you lean into that legacy. What Russia lacks in the traditional measures of power, it makes up for with acres and acres of Cold War stockpiles. Ironically, now that it has lost so much equipment, we are seeing footage of hundreds of old Cold War tanks pulled from storage, dusted off, loaded onto rail cars, and shipped to Ukraine. Russia has tens of thousands of old Soviet tanks in storage, including versions of the newer T-90s, T-80s, and their time-tested predecessors that make up the backbone of the Ukrainian armored force, the T-72 and the T-64. but footage is emerging of Russian T-62s being modernized at Russian armored repair plants and shipped to the front. These tanks are nothing short of obsolete in the modern era, and they have been since they started to be replaced back in 1975. Which begs the question, why are they bothering with all these Cold War relics at all? A lot of it has to do with how hard it is to maintain newer tanks in storage. Since they operate using more sophisticated electronic components that, as we well know, are more and more difficult to source, it seems that Russia has tried to pull bunches of T-72s, T-80s and T-90s out of storage, only to realize how expensive and difficult it might be to make them combat ready. A fair portion of these were probably mothballed to begin with. As tanks are left in storage without maintenance, they atrophy. Rubber treads and wheels crack and chip, mice chew through exposed wires, armor rusts and corrodes. A true nightmare for Russian mechanics. The humble T-62 was mass-produced with one idea in mind: make it simple, make it good, and make a crap ton of them. Simple designs mean fewer electronics, greater ease of repair, and interchangeability of parts. Like that old reliable 1966 Chevy you have in your shed. No matter how many years go by, it will always seem to start right up. That's the type of tank the T-62 was. The fact Russia had something in the region of 20,000 of these in storage at the end of the Cold War means there are plenty of stocks to draw from. The bigger question is whether or not it's even worth it. Would Americans be happy if the US Army started dusting off Vietnam vintage M60 patterns from storage, slapping on a fresh coat of paint, better comms, and a pair of thermal sights and said, "Go to and prosper"? Of course not. But when has the Kremlin cared what its soldiers think? Repair plants across Russia are now churning out oodles of Cold War antiques. Most of these museums on tracks culled from deep storage that have not seen combat in decades, if at all, and their maintenance records reflect that. Some are being fitted with new engines, thermal imaging, bulkier armor, new comms, better optics, and cope cages. It probably won't be enough to protect their crews from certain destruction. One plant near Chita in Siberia has allegedly been tasked with refurbishing 800 T-62s by 2025. Some were used to defend the north bank of the Dnipro River after Ukraine's recent liberation of Kherson. We don't know how many will ultimately see combat, but we do know the mere presence of T-62s on the battlefield in Ukraine is an indictment of Russian power. Talks to provide the Ukraine with Western main battle tanks continue, but at the end of the day, Ukraine is capturing and repurposing far more abandoned Russian tanks than they will ever receive from the West. If a new Russian offensive is right around the corner, as many experts believe, they'll need to try to conserve their dwindling armored force if they hope to avoid campaigning with a military propped up by scores of refurbished T-62s. As backwards as it might be to say this, sometimes old equipment is enough to get the job done over the long haul. This may even be Putin's diabolical plan. He knows that if the West buckles and does not commit to supplying Ukraine with the armor it needs to continue fighting, waves of Russian conscripts and mercenaries using outdated equipment might just be enough to attrite, suffocate, and bleed the Ukrainians dry, even if it means he has nobody left at the end of the war to celebrate his hollow victory. Let's hope that possibility doesn't come true. But what do you think? Will Russia's continued loss of tanks be a defining factor in the outcome of the Russian-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.